Thank you for joining me today for another episode of Hunger Hunt Feast. Today, I want to get into the inflammation theory of the PUFA vegetable oils being drivers of disease, as opposed to the to date over the last 40 years vilified, or really 50 or 60 vilified saturated fats and dietary cholesterol. Uh, you've probably heard me mention this before, but I mean, we're talking about the basic vegetable oils that you are sold in the grocery store, told to be heart healthy. They're in just about some element of them is in the majority of processed foods, anything in a box, bag, or bottle. Um, that's a mix of food, you know, whether it's a salad dressing, cracker, cookie, cereal, bread, it's got these in it. Now, of course, we're all familiar with the lipid heart hypothesis theory that, as I mentioned, saturated fat, dietary cholesterol cause heart disease. And upon a closer look at the weak data from epidemiological studies, as well as meta-analysis of actual randomized controlled trials, it showed little or no evidence to support that. And I've actually got studies listed. It'll be in the show notes, several studies in the show notes this episode, to show that is just there's just nothing to support it. It's a lot of bad data, basically. Um, and I've got some books to recommend that can help you get a little deeper into why we have that data, how that came about. If you really want to unpack that more, there's just not enough room in one episode to do all that. But I want to get into really the oils, and then a little into why the saturated fats just aren't a thing, aren't a problem. Really, are should be preferential, but really get into these oils, because it's just we talk about it, but there's still a lot of unknown. People don't realize just how um, inflammatory these oils are. We had, just to back up a little bit, dietary cholesterol limits were removed from the USDA dietary guidelines after it was clearly shown that most of cholesterol that we eat really doesn't get absorbed. It's esterified, and we can only absorb non-esterified. Plus, our liver makes the majority of our cholesterol in our blood, probably about 1 to 2 grams a day. We have a pool of probably, uh, easily 2 or 3 grams. I mean, you just have a large pool of um, cholesterol in our body, because every cell in our body makes it to create its own um, cell membrane. And uh, in addition to our liver. So what we don't eat, our liver will make. So it's very tightly regulated, um, a byproduct, or real nutrient, really, that we need. We need for every cell membrane. We need to make hormones. We need to create vitamin D. We need for brain function, for cellular, for neurocellular transmission. So the synapses to connect. We need, and we use it to make lipid rafts on our cells for insulin. They hold the insulin receptors. So insulin sensitivity, you got cholesterol, but your cell membranes are made up of cholesterol, and nearly every cell in our body makes their own cholesterol, but our liver creates a pool of 4 times of stress. We're making cortisol, okay, or you just need, or an infection. We need it. We have its backup in our blood and in our liver. Um, but our liver makes great majority, like 80-90% of the of cholesterol um, that would be in your blood. Okay. Um, so it's tightly regulated. Saturated fat has also received a bad reputation because it can raise cholesterol. But when you take a little closer look, we need to realize that not all cholesterol is the same. It's not all the same quality. Okay. And so, since we're talking about fat in terms of how it generates cholesterol in our system, that's really the fear of fat. Since dietary cholesterol um, isn't absorbed, doesn't really raise cholesterol levels, they turn to saturated fat to continue to make it the villain, um, as the driver of elevated cholesterol. We're paying a lot of attention to quantity of cholesterol, but not quality. And I think that's where we got to dig in and take a closer look. Because there's different different types of cholesterol. You may not realize that. So we have very small, dense particles called VLDL, very low density lipoproteins, which tend to be very triglyceride rich. They transport triglycerides from our liver to other parts of our body for either for storage or for energy. Triglycerides are a fat molecule. Okay. And we tend to have a lot of them when we're eating, coming out of our liver. Okay. When we're eating a lot of sugar, because sugar tends to get all processed in the liver, all fructose does, and then about 20% of the glucose in a sugar molecule. So we'll all go to the liver. Liver gets overloaded with glycogen. It starts making fat, and it can store some in the liver, and then it starts pumping it out. So it's like, I don't want all this fat here. So it's just pumping out triglycerides to other parts of the body for storage or burning um, as needed. So the LDL is delivering these triglycerides. So it's LDL is the cholesterol, right? But it's delivering triglycerides, which is a fat molecule. So LDL also delivers antioxidants, A, D, E. Okay. So it can, A, E, it delivers a variety of, I rattle off all that. You can Google that part if you want, but all the antioxidants and nutrients that the LDL delivers in addition to cholesterol and triglycerides. So there's a lot of use or need for LDL particle, which is a protein particle, which covers these lipids, these fats, both cholesterol and lipids. I should call them lipids, are both cholesterol and triglycerides, fat molecules, because cholesterol and the triglycerides and being fats do not travel well in our bloodstream by themselves. Oil and water don't mix, right? Fat and water don't mix. So we need a protein covering, which is the LDL, to transport them. So there's a native, what they call native LDL, which is just created from the liver. Okay, has not been damaged. It's often a large, fluffy, mostly just cholesterol and the antioxidants being delivered by the LDL. Very low in triglycerides or no triglycerides, but it's large and fluffy. Which I mentioned before, the VLDL, which are triglyceride rich, tend to be very small and dense. Remember that. Oxidized LDL, which is basically fats, the fats and triglycerides carried in the LDL have become oxidized, and that can lead to oxidizing the whole LDL part, the other lipids in the LDL particle. That's important as well. We don't want oxidized LDL. We don't want small dense LDL. We want the large, fluffy stuff. That's the better quality. That's not as likely to get caught in our arteries, more likely to bounce on by. So generally, just to explain heart disease, how that works, when endothelial tissue of the artery, so the inner lining of the artery, is healthy, that LDL, that big fluffy stuff especially, will just bounce on by. But any LDL is not likely to get caught in it because it's healthy. There's no inflammation. And it just goes where it delivers the fat, the lipids, the antioxidants where they're supposed to go. But when that tissue is inflamed, it becomes more porous and sticky. Think about how you maybe scrape your hand, you scrape your knee, and that tissue, while it's healing, if you take the top layer of skin off, it's kind of sticky, right? You got white blood cells coming and creating, trying to recreate skin, but fight off bacteria. So that area is kind of sticky and tacky. Anything will stick to it, right? It's very porous. Well, think of the same thing inside your endothelial tissue in your artery. If it becomes inflamed, you're going to have particles sticking to it. And what's more likely to get stuck to it are the small, dense LDL particles. Okay. The small, dense ones and the oxidized. The oxidized ones typically having more fat. So they're going to be small, dense as well because they're getting oxidized by the oxidized fat. And then our immune system kind of kicks in and sends monocytes to begin this healing process of the inflammation. Okay, so that's like part of our immune system. It's the blood cells sending out these monocytes, and you get the macrophages, which are like the little, if you've seen the diagrams, look like little Pac-Men come by and eat up bacteria and other foreign invaders. And that they create foam cells, which then turn to plaque. And this is, build up to basically shore up this inflamed tissue, shore up the cracks and fissures. But this plaque builds up to kind of as part of the healing process, like a scab. Think of it that way. It's part of the immune system. And so when this plaque builds up quite a bit, you can, as we know, narrow the arteries. It's not fat, as the old theory went, um, that builds up in arteries to block arteries or to narrow arteries. It's not fat building up there. It's plaque. And the cholesterol can get just caught up in this plaque building process, and with the foam cells, especially the again small dense or the oxidized, and it just becomes part of the structure, part of the plaque structure. So it's not really the cause of it. It's kind of it's floating by, it's doing what it's supposed to do, more or less, and it gets caught up in the repair of this inflammation. Um, Now, still, even with the inflammation, the large, fluffy LDL, the native LDL, which is carrying cholesterol, but not a lot of triglycerides, if any, are the ones that tend to still float on by, even with the inflammation. Okay, they're more likely to just bounce on by. They're too big to get caught in those cracks and fissures. They're just dense, and they're lighter. So they just float. They bounce. Um, but then with this plaque, it can be stable or unstable. And if it's unstable, some of it can break off. Our immune system again attacks that within the blood vessel. So it's plaques floating through your bloodstream. Not good. We don't want foreign things in our bloodstream, right? So red blood cells attack, create a blood clot around that loose piece of plaque. That blood clot tries to go through a narrowed section of artery. There we have your heart attack. So it's a combination of things, but it's not just fat building up in your arteries and clogging things. That's very rudimentary. It's not a real true understanding of what's happening. The driver of heart disease is inflammation, whether caused by bacteria or oxidized LDL can cause that. As I mentioned on last episode, I'm talking about insulin and high blood sugar and insulin, high insulin levels, chronically high, not just high because you just had a meal, but chronically high can cause inflammation in the arteries as well. There's a number of causes. And that bacteria, much of that bacteria actually comes from the mouth. I think it's 53% is what the current number is, percentage of bacteria that causes heart disease actually starts in the mouth. When you have periodontitis, and you have bleeding gums, and that you usually have an overgrowth of bacteria. And some of it can come from the gut as well. But it's, again, we're talking about inflammation and systemic inflammation. And so we have, you probably know, familiar with omega-3 fats being great for anti-inflammatory effects in our body. So people taking fish oil supplements, eating more fish, taking krill oil to get those omega-3s in there. And that's to oppose the omega-6s, which are inflammatory. We need both because we need to be able to have both inflammation and anti-inflammation in all systems. So we have a good ratio of a 3 to 6 omega-3s to omega-6s. Ideal would be like 1-to-1 ratio. It was even. That would be perfect world. So maybe like go back, a few thousand years, hunter gatherer, or even just a few hundred, depending on where you are, where they're really living off the land, right? You need a good ratio of animal and probably some plant, but what they could hunt and gather. Maybe it's up to 4-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3, still a healthy, reasonable ratio. But we are far out of proportion with omega-6 now from our diet. I think that in the 1900s, prior to 1900s, we're probably like a 10-to-1 ratio, maybe of omega-6s to omega-3s. But that's definitely we've gone up. Now we can get some omega-6s from, say, whole food, like nuts, seeds. Some animal sources will have some omega-6s. Obviously, some animal fats will have both because they eat plants. Omega-6s tend to come from plants. But again, if we're eating like we did maybe even 200 years ago, we'd have a decent ratio. And in the 1900s, 10-to-1, pretty good ratio. We had very little disease, very little heart disease, very little cancer. Okay, that's really increased through the 20th century, through the 1900s. Again, hunter-gatherer tribes probably 1-to-1, 4-to-1, maybe 6-to-1, but much closer to even. Still single digits in both cases. The average American now is probably 25 to 50 omega-6 to 1 omega-3. way out of balance. Ratio is way out of balance. So we have a lot of inflammation coming in just from this type of fats, purely a type of fats. Yes, there's other things that cause inflammation, bacteria, so forth, but just from the fats alone, omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, we have an inflammation issue. And this is going to affect the chemistry in our whole body. It's going to affect the fats we use to make cells, right? Those fats, these omega-6 fats get in our cells. We use fats for structure. The fats that we eat end up in our cells, not to clog them, for basic functions and for structure. So what's the other source if it's not nuts and some occasional animal fat and some seeds and it's vegetable oils, which are used in cooking and processed food. So even if you don't cook with them directly at home, maybe you just use olive oil for cooking. If you're eating processed food of any kind, you're getting them. So canola, typical canola, soybean oil, safflower oil, corn oil, cottonseed oil. Cottonseed becoming came to our diet really with cottonseed being Crisco, in the early 1900s, being one of the first big products. It was originally a lubricant for machinery, but hey, this looks like something people could cook with. Let's sell it as a lard replacement. So Crisco, cottonseed oil. Then we have margarine, of course, came in, and that really came in during World War II when we had shortages of butter, dairy, lots of food shortages. So we had margarine, which is made from corn oil traditionally. And I believe it was then as well. But now, almost 20% of the average American's calories come from soybean oil. Believe it or not, 20% of your calories come from soybean oil because it's in everything. And 70% of the American diet is processed food. And most processed food has some type of vegetable oil in it. And I've got some charts I linked to in the show notes. You'll see charts that increase consumption of vegetable oil, or soybean oil specifically, through the 20th century. We're eating less beef, more chicken. So doing what we're supposed to do, but there's a lot more soybean oil, a lot less dairy, beef, or pork, and a lot more chicken and soybean oil and some other vegetable oils. But soybean oil is like the number one source of fat in the US. It's a huge crop. Number one soy, and that soybean oil is a byproduct of the actual soy. I mean, think about it. It's a grain. It's a bean. They're pulling oil out of a bean. There's not a lot of fat in beans. So you're talking about a lot of soybeans to make all that oil that goes into all the processed food. It's a byproduct. It's try to add some texture to a non-fat food or to a processed food. It's nasty, and most of them are GMO, as you must know, genetically modified. So even worse. So again, they're main ingredients in processed food along with refined grains and sugar. So you probably know that. But they're all these fats are oils, which means they're liquid, right? They're not solid room temperature. They're liquid room temperature, which means they're unsaturated, specifically PUFAs, so polyunsaturated fatty acids. And these are the fats we've been told to eat for many decades now, most of the 20th century, really, because we want to use them to replace saturated fats for our health. Yes, there's air quotes around that. Saturated fat, saturation of a fat refers to its stability. It has nothing to do with it's not a health. The term is not used to describe any type of health marker one way or the other. Saturated means has to do with the number of molecules or double bonds in the molecule that have either all hydrogen molecules, so it's filled in, or if it's saturated, all filled in, and it makes it very stable. Saturated is stable. If it's unsaturated, that means there's more double bonds, more open spots for another, like the oxygen molecule, to come along and attach itself, where there's hydrogen molecule missing. Oxygen molecule can come along and attach itself. Basically, it becomes more unstable. Monounsaturated only has one double bond alone. That polyunsaturated would have several. And that determines how easily it can be oxidized or peroxidized, as they refer to it, for lipids. So basically, when an electron is stolen from one of the molecules, it creates like a free radical, really a free radical reaction, what they call a free radical cascade. So the oxidation continues, that molecule with the electron stolen, so it's bouncing around and trying to steal electron from somebody else. So it just continues like a chain reaction of stealing electrons from another molecule. So you get again the free radical cascade. So it's not just one event. One event turns into many more. This doesn't really happen with saturated fats because they're stable. So it really comes the unsaturated, mostly polyunsaturated fats, because of the open molecule situation, like I mentioned, with more double bonds. Again, so the monounsaturated fats are olive oil and avocado oil primarily. There's a few nuts that might qualify for that, maybe macadamia. But the ones that we see are like olive oil, avocado oil. They're much more stable. They're much more heat resistant. They're less likely to be oxidized, and they're really good for us. They really are. And although, as far as omega-3, omega-6, monounsaturated omega-9, so we can make omega-9s. We can make all the omega-9s we need for the most part in our bodies with omega-3s and omega-6s. Omega-3s and omega-6s we have to eat. We can't create those, but we can make omega-9s from the omega-3s and omega-6s. And again, olive oil and avocados or olives and avocados, I should say, are fruit. They aren't vegetable oils. They're not grains. Really, these oils are called seed oils. These vegetable oils are often called seed oil because we make it, technically, yes, you can call them vegetables, but honestly, they're not. They're very starchy. They're grains, or seeds. And the more fats are a mix. So most fats are a mix of saturated and unsaturated. So it's not as simple as you're either all saturated or all unsaturated. There's usually a mix of them. And there's unsaturated fats in beef, pork, chicken, fish. And there's saturated fats in all those fish, in plant oils, many of the plant oils, in obviously. So the more saturated it is, the more solid it is. Like coconut oil, solid at room temperature. You get a little bit warm, goes liquid very quickly. Coconut oil is probably one of the most saturated oils out there, much more so than most animal based fats that you might cook with. But if it's liquid, it's mostly unsaturated. If it's solid at room temperature, it's mostly saturated. But again, the whole food based. So in whole food form, the omega-6s and the omega-3s, which are both polyunsaturated and stable, extracted from the whole food, become very unstable. But the whole food form, in the nut, in the seed, in the fish, they're good. In the animal, they're good. They're stable. They're not as likely to start oxidizing until you maybe cooking. High heat could change that within that whole food, but they're not oxidizing just sitting in the nut, the seed, the fish. When they become extracted and bottled or used as an additive in a processed food, then we have the problem. Then these unstable fats become oxidized pretty much immediately. They start oxidizing. They become exposed to air. They're out of their stable environment. They're exposed to light, more heat in the processing, but they become very unstable and become oxidized. They start oxidizing right away. You add heat to them for cooking, or the process of making the food product. Yeah, you got it going. So restaurants cook with it. Usually, often, I should say often, they're using that oil for a week or more, depends on the restaurant. Supposed to get rid of it after a week, but they can use it for more. So the more they cook with it, the more oxidized it becomes. And you start getting these things called aldehydes formed in the fat, which is transferred to the food that you're eating. They're extremely toxic, extremely inflammatory in our systems. And there's even evidence of these aldehydes getting in the air. They're connecting. They're having a problem in a lot of the fast food restaurants and other restaurant kitchens where they're using these oils that are over and over again, and it's sticking to the sides of the kitchen. They can't get it off. They have special cleaners to get them out. It's getting into the uniforms of these fast food restaurants in the back of the kitchens, where some of these, there's records of them actually, when they're sent off to the cleaners or put in the dryer, the aldehydes that have settled into the uniforms actually cause spontaneous combustion. The uniforms catch on fire, either in the dryer or on the way the cleaning cleaners, they catch on fire. That's pretty inflammatory. If they catch on fire, it's very unstable. So putting that in your body, you want to avoid that as much as possible, right? I think that seems pretty obvious now. But these, and as I mentioned, the oxidized LDL are the ones that are more likely to be found in the arterial plaques. They're just more likely to get caught in there, which come from oxidized fat. So we're eating the fat that's oxidized. We're eating the fat in the processed food and the salad dressing, because you can say olive oil in your salad dressing bottle. Yeah, it's got some olive oil, but it's probably also got a lot of soybean oil or canola oil in there with it. So it'd be very rare, very rare to find a whole, a bottle in the grocery store that's all olive oil and vinegar. And when it's oxidized, when the LDL gets oxidized from the oxidized fats it's taking, which affects the rest of the molecule, they aren't recognized by the body, where the areas where they're supposed to go to be picked up and deliver these nutrients and the energy. So they end up staying in circulation longer. And they're also not recognized by the liver's LDL receptors, which is supposed to pick up LDL after it's made its circulation and be recycled in the liver. So that oxidation process, almost, if you think of the LDL particles having like a little flag or a label on it, that allows it to be recognized and picked up by the cells that need them, need the nutrients, need the fats, be liver, need the cholesterol. And the oxidizing process of carrying that oxidized fat damages that label. And so it's not recognized, it's not picked up, so it stays in your circulation longer. The longer it's in your circulation, the more likely it is to get caught in a plaque with that inflammation going on, right? So it's just longer, more time in your bloodstream, because nothing recognizes it. So it's just floating around, continuing to oxidize. It's a problem. And the more, so again, they be caught in the inflamed tissue. And then you get also more inflammation from the action of the free radicals. So that oxidized fat in your system, again, so there's the inflammation gets caught. Yes, the oxidized LDL gets caught in inflammation, but the actual oxidized fat creates inflammation because it's stealing free radicals and calling that free radical cascade. So it's creating more systemic inflammation. So it can create its own inflammation that it then turns around and gets caught in the plaque, with the plaque formation. So you got two problems in one. And again, our ratios of omega-6s to omega-3s are so far out of balance. And bringing that closer to where we need to is going to be a first step in lowering your inflammation, lowering your risk of this disease, heart disease, and other cancer as well, stroke. So the idea is to reduce the omega-6 intake, and if you can, increase the omega-3 intake as well. But you're not going to be able to increase omega-3 enough to catch up to your current level of omega-6s if you have a typical diet. So you've got really, if you're talking about 25 to 1, 50 to 1, the most obvious place to change, maybe you can double the amount of omega-3s you bring in, but you need to cut the omega-6s down by, multiples of 10. That's where the big problem is. And so they're known as the hateful eight, these oils, the most common ones: corn, canola, cottonseed, soybean, safflower, sunflower, rice bran oil, and grapeseed oil. Okay. Again, they don't like heat. They're already oxidizing when they hit the bottle, when they hit in that food. You just read labels, avoid them as much as possible. And you'll find if you start reading labels, you're going to see them more and more. They're in everything. But what's become obvious as we look at how much we consume these oils and how much that has increased through the 20th century, that heart disease has continued to increase along with the consumption of the omega-6 fats and our decreased intake of animal fats and other saturated fats. So, the charts I included show increase of soybean oil, decrease of beef, decrease of pork, decrease of dairy, whole fat dairy. So we're doing what we're told to do, and the disease keeps getting worse, right? More diabetes, more obesity, more heart disease, more cancer. Um, and again, I've got several studies showing there's no evidence to support the current guidelines on fat. There's actually, when there are low serum cholesterol, low blood cholesterol, is associated with a higher risk of stroke, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. Now, it's a Japanese medical school study. Got a link to that as well. You've probably heard of that one. But this fight against cholesterol and total cholesterol levels is ridiculous. And we have evidence to show actually lower cholesterol creates a higher risk of cardiovascular disease and stroke and cancer. And a study you may not have seen, omega-6 vegetable oils as a driver of heart disease. So again, we're showing, finally coming out some evidence or some study showing that the intake, the eating more omega-6 oils actually can drive heart disease through the inflammatory method. So it's not just speculation on a few of us health nuts saying, hey, we like our saturated fats. There's actually some study looking to backing up the process, the biochemistry of how this works. So again, we got to look at cholesterol quality, fat quality, focus on lowering triglycerides and those which would mean fewer small, dense LDL particles, fewer fat particles in the LDL, more large, fluffy LDL, and less oxidized fat. We want more stable, saturated fat to replace the fat in our cells. So that's mostly what we mostly have: monounsaturated fat, and then we have saturated fat when we're born. Okay, and replacing with these omega-6 fats and having more plant sterols instead of cholesterol, animal protein, animal cholesterol that we normally have, that works for creating our vitamin D or hormones like cortisol and testosterone and estrogen, and our lipid rafts for the insulin sensitive insulin receptors, and for the connections between neurons. The brain's like by weight 15% cholesterol, and about 25% of your body's 25% of your body's total cholesterol is in your brain. So you want to start replacing what's naturally there, which is animal cholesterol, with plant sterols. You might see a problem because we weren't born with plant sterols or plant fats in our cells, in our brain, creating hormones with those. We're born with cholesterol, creating those as part of those functions. And replacing with plant sterols, that's when we start getting into problems. So you create the plant sterols from an excessive amount of plant fat. So we need less oxidized fat, more stable, more saturated fat to replace the fat and cholesterol in our cells. And as well, more the EPA and DHA, which is the omega-3s we get from fish. More of that. Include fish in your diet, whether it's sardines, some salmon, some oysters. Just try to get into those fatty fish. Get that in your diet on a weekly basis. Get it in there. We can actually get, grass-fed beef. Probably heard some people talking about the benefit of the fats of grass-fed beef. Grass-fed beef actually has DPA, not DHA or EPA. So DPA from grass-fed beef actually converts, about 30% of it converts to DHA, which is one of the harder ones to get outside of fish. Okay. And then the people will say, well, I take flaxseed oil, which is ALA, which is omega-3, but we still have to convert that. We can't really use ALA too well. We need the EPA and DHA. Only about 5% of flax, or the ALA, alpha linoleic acid, converts to EPA, and 0.5% converts to DHA. So compare that to grass-fed beef with 30%. Yeah. Eat your grass-fed beef instead of your flax oil, please, all day long. But fish really is your best source of those omega-3s in the fish, ideally. Because I hate to say this, but even an omega-3 supplement, because it's been extracted from the fish and sitting in supplements, heat, it's packaged, processed, it's susceptible to oxidation. You can have an oxidized omega-3. You don't want that either. Go for ocean-based fish, because figure a farm-raised fish is going to be fed soybeans and corn. That's going to throw off its omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in that fish. So there's no point in eating it if it's farm-raised, because it's your omega-3 to omega-6 ratio is off compared to what a fish should be. Ocean-based fish, if you're worried about mercury, just limit it based on that. But that's your best source of EPA and DHA, which are necessary for brain function, big time. But just total anti-inflammatory fats, right? Um, Monounsaturated, again, is great from olive oil or avocado oil. That's omega-9s, but we can make that. So it's not imperative that you have olive oil. If you have enough omega-3s and balance out the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, you're going to have the benefits of that anti-inflammatory. So they've actually, another study, so you can, no matter how much omega-3 you take, um, if you have an out of balance omega-6, there was no benefit to reducing the risk of heart disease. It's the abundance of, if you're having 25 to 1, 50 to 1, you're taking some omega-6, omega-3 supplements, excuse me, good luck. I mean, you've got to reduce the omega-6s. There's just not a great benefit at just trying to increase the omega-3s. So get the fish in there, ocean caught, however you can find it, herring, gippers, sardines, whatever you can manage. Um, but you've got to reduce those oils. Cooking, whatever you, please don't cook with those things. Cook with saturated fat or olive oil. Low to medium heat. If I'm going to do olive oil, I'll keep it low to medium heat. Mostly use saturated fat, coconut oil, lard, butter, ghee, which is just a clarified butter. More common in Eastern, like East Indian, um, maybe some other Asian foods, but it's very tasty. Ghee is wonderful, beautiful tasting. Probably what my favorite as far as taste. Beef tallow. We use some beef tallow here. Duck fat, avocado oil. If you want to do that, it's like the olive oil. I actually stop at a little lard's hard to find anymore that isn't overly processed or mixed with, like it's become sort of trans fat or more highly processed. I actually found a little carniceria, uh, little Mexican American owned grocery store where they have like a deli and a butcher. They sell raw meat as well as the some cooked dishes, and they render their own lard. And so I buy a little tub of it from there. But you can find it even online. But you just got to look around. But that would be a good place to start locally to try to find some good lard. If you want to save your bacon drippings, that could work. Um, but and just avoid processed food. Read the labels, like I mentioned. Make your own salad dressing with olive oil or avocado oil. Um, but you've got to stay away from those omega-6s. Nuts are fine. If they're dry roasted, I'd say avoid ones that are roasted in oil, because usually it's going to be a peanut oil, some kind of oil that's a canola oil, something that's an omega-6. So you're just adding them to their cooking them, roasting them in it, more inflammation. So go for a dry roasted if you're going to do a roasted nut. There's no reason to avoid whole eggs. I actually got another study where it's actually the more one egg or more eaten, I think it was daily, actually reduced risk of heart disease. So I know adding one food to reduce heart disease, it seems silly, doesn't it? It's like, what are you actually doing through your whole day? So I'm not sure how they created that, but the thing is, what it didn't show was a greater risk of heart disease. They showed a reduced risk of heart disease with people who were eating eggs. So maybe eating those whole eggs was a reflection of their whole healthy lifestyle and the fact that they reject the dogma we've heard for the last 40 years to avoid eggs. They're probably doing other things like rejecting omega-6s. They're eating fewer refined grains and sugar, and eating whole eggs and great things like red meat and lamb, which also have saturated fat, but there's no reason to avoid whole eggs, red meat, like beef, lamb, you know, um, the ruminant meat. Okay. So wild game, bison, beef, lamb, highly nutritious, full of the micronutrients, the A, the E, B vitamins, zinc, selenium, full of those because they're great at taking the nutrients out of the grass with their division of four stomachs. That's what makes them special, makes the ruminants special. Is their stomach has four divisions in it, really. Stomach, and it is able to pull the nutrients out of there because they chew it, regurgitate, read it. They're spending so much time digesting it. Um, so it's really, I mean, again, I have these studies. I got one link describing, for those who want to dig deeper, the peroxidation or the oxidation of lipids. Um, Another one, cardiac pro-inflammatory pathways are altered with different dietary omega-6 to omega-3 ratios in normal fat-fed pigs. So basically, they gave these pigs more omega-6s and they had more inflammatory pathways in their arteries. I have again, the chart showing more that we're eating more soybean oil than anything else. And then our fats are coming from soy, oil, chicken, and shortening. We're eating more sugar, of course, to go along with that. And we're eating less beef, pork, and dairy. Um, and then one showing the dietary sources for us of linoleic acid, alpha linoleic acid, another plant-based. It's the ALA, highly oxidized through the 20th century. It's another chart. Dietary cholesterol from physiology to cardiovascular risk, showing dietary cholesterol, no impact on cardiovascular risk. The one I mentioned before, low cholesterol is associated with mortality from stroke, heart disease, and cancer. That's with the Jichi, I'm probably saying that wrong, but Jichi Medical School cohort study. That's one in Japan. The theory of the omega-6 vegetable oils as a driver of coronary heart disease, as well as one that's an evidence from randomized controlled trials that did not support the introduction of dietary fat guidelines in 1977 and 1983. So basically the food pyramid, don't remember. And it's a systematic review of meta-analysis. And the one after that is evidence from those randomly controlled trials that doesn't support the dietary fat guidelines. So those last two, basically looking at the RCTs, the randomly controlled trials that were used to form our dietary fat guidelines, starting in 77 with a basic, meeting of this. It's basically it was a Senate committee essentially, and then in 1983 when they formed the food pyramid with all of our guidelines that come out that we now know as so-called normal, with avoiding saturated fat. When they look closer at the analysis and they look at thousands of people, we're talking about tens of thousands of people in these various studies, there's no evidence. Evidence does not support that saturated fat causes heart disease. And in that one of the, I believe it was the first one. It was one from 2015. When you look, there's 115 with a follow-up and 16 of the same. If you really want to dig in that study, it shows a link to each of those studies that they looked at. So if you're a little geeky like me and you like to see, hey, what they find in these studies going back over the last 30 years that threw up red flags and said, no, this doesn't work. The way they gathered the evidence doesn't work. The way they gathered the data, the way they controlled the control group versus the experiment group, right? Doesn't add up. There's links to that in there. So I just want to make it kind of data rich because I know this is a controversial subject. This is contradicting everything we've been told for the last 40, 50 years, everything that's been basically canonized by government, USDA, and our guidelines with the support of many processed food companies like PepsiCo, General Mills, many of these oil companies that make these cooking oils definitely fund them, and the food contracts that come from to our schools, hospitals, military, elderly care facilities that are federally federally based. There's contracts in place. There's subsidies in place to subsidize the source of these from our government. We subsidize corn, soy, wheat, right? So we're subsidizing the processed food, and then we're building contracts. We have our health and food-based authorities creating food contracts with the processed food companies. And we wonder why our nutrition information from our government authorities and from the Nutrition Academy, which certifies registered dietitians, seems to be maybe not catching up with even the studies that we have now, right? It's not listening. It's not paying attention. It's not changing their tune. They're very slow to change. They're very slow to take the dietary cholesterol limits off, even though that evidence has been around for a while. They're very slow to change the dietary saturated fat recommendations, even though there's no evidence to support them. And very slow. And they keep putting, telling us, hey, eat this crappy cereal because it's got some element of grain in it that once upon a time was probably a whole grain with a lot of fiber wrapped around it. Now it's just a mushy piece of starch. It's supposed to be heart healthy and lower cholesterol. Well, who cares if we lower cholesterol if cholesterol is not an issue and there's no link to high cholesterol? We want cholesterol quality. You see what I'm saying? We got problems. So I put these studies in to counter. It's a little heavily weighted on the study side to counter the dogma from our so-called health authorities that really have been heavily influenced by the food manufacturing companies. So it's a sad state of affairs for us and for all Western. It's the same true as in Europe, Australia, probably a little more progressive in Europe with their information, and even Japan was showing study on eggs. But hey, this is how it gets out. It gets out through social media. It gets out through the low carb community, without throwing up divisions between carnivores, keto, low carb. We all understand that these vegetable oils, processed grains, and sugar are killing us, and they just entered our diet since about 1900 in a large scale, much larger scale than they ever did. So rather than throwing up barriers between whether it's mainly the seed oils or mainly the sugar and the refined grains, it's all three. We don't need any of them in a large scale. They're going to slip in enough trying to avoid them. But it gets out through social media, through podcasts, through blogs. Right now, because our government's health authorities have failed us, and our academia, our schools have failed us because they're just a result of the nutrition guidelines from the governments. So this is how it gets out. So I'm asking you, share this podcast, share other posts that you see, share blogs that you see that are giving this information out. It's vital to our health, but this is the only way. It's got to be grassroots for it to change. Who knows if it'll ever change the government? We can't wait. We can't wait for it to change from the top down. We got to change it from the bottom up. So please share. Talk to you next week.